Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today. And in today's episode, we have buying a turnkey rental in 2024. Before we get into today's episode, as always, just a couple of quick announcements. First, I would like to announce the winner from our premium subscribers. As always, or as recently started, I guess, earlier, it was Q4 of last year we decided to start doing this. Every quarter, we're going to try to give something away, and we've been doing sort of a $25 e-gift card giveaway to our premium subscribers. I have this little wheel of names. I kind of Googled it, and I put all the premium subscriber names in there, spin the wheel at random, and we get a winner. So I would like to announce this quarter's winner for Q2 of 2024, and that is Thomas N. That's right, Thomas N. Congratulations. You are the winner of a $25 e-gift card. In the past, I used to pick where that gift card is. I think we did Domino's, and for example, in the past, Panera, I think we did one time. So I will actually be reaching out to you, Thomas, directly to ask where you'd like the gift card to, and we will give you $25 to wherever you would like, and we'll send that to you via email. So thanks again to all of our premium subscribers for helping to support the show. If you would like to consider becoming premium, feel free to click in the show notes and click on the link that says Become a Premium Subscriber today, and you can read about the different benefits of being a premium subscriber, this being one of them. Also, we got an email from another premium subscriber, and they sent in a picture of, it actually looked really, really nice. I have a few of them. I don't have this color combo. They did a navy blue Real Talk Personal Finance t-shirt with a white logo. Looked really clean. She said that it came in pretty quickly. I know sometimes, and I've mentioned this on other shows, when we do merch orders for different things, sometimes they take a little bit of time to come in. I had that recently, not too long ago, with one of the onesies that I ordered. But she sent in a picture to the show, said it came in really quick. She is a premium subscriber, so she used the promo code to get 25% off. If you're interested in rocking some Real Talk Personal Finance merch, there's a link in the show notes. We do have a promo code for everybody to give you 10% off, so check that out. Anyone that's premium, you guys get 25%, and you have your own promo code, another benefit of being a premium subscriber. All right, I think that's about it in the way of announcements. Let's go ahead and get started and get into today's show. For anybody that is interested in learning about or hearing about turnkey rentals, if you've not already listened to it, you can go back in the archives. We did a real estate mini-series, and I did an episode on turnkey rentals, what it is, what it isn't, and that will kind of give you the basics for those that aren't familiar. So if you're already caught up to speed, awesome. If you haven't checked that out, you may want to go back and listen to that before today's show. But today I want to talk about buying a turnkey rental in 2024. So anybody that heard my most recent episode, which was from the Millionaires Unveiled podcast, and we talked a little bit about turnkey rentals and sort of, my story and a little bit about the portfolio. Again, that was recorded back in January of 2024. It just came out here in June of 2024. So, it's a little bit, not really dated, but it's about 5 months or so old. There was a time, including when I recorded that episode, that, as I mentioned, I just couldn't get the numbers to work, and I just couldn't get things to pencil. And so I wasn't investing, at least at that moment in time, in turnkey. Well, I had the rentals that we had, but I wasn't buying any more. And I was looking and would like to, and I was patient and started to get a little bit impatient. And I am in the process, by the time this episode comes out, I believe I'll be closing the very next day on our next turnkey rental property. But I was patient and maybe somewhat inebriated when we went on a little vacation down in Mexico and decided to go under contract for our next turnkey rental property. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that on today's episode. and just to kind of go over a few things in terms of why we do this and maybe why my mind has changed a little bit and I'm more optimistic now, I think, than I was not too long ago. So ever since, I think back right around the time frame of January, even late last year in 2023, January 2024, I have been getting these property emails from the turnkey provider that we work with. And again, as I mentioned on the previous episode, I just could not get the numbers to pencil. And most of those, and this isn't the end all be all, but one of the things that we often look at is kind of a quick back of the napkin type of gut check as to whether or not this makes sense. Do we need to pursue this any further? Is this going to be, a meaningful rental that produces some sort of positive cash flow? Is what a lot of people are familiar with that's called the 1% rule. And for those that may not be familiar, and this was true especially several years ago, it's much harder to come by today. But generally speaking, if you could find a property that had monthly rental income, gross rental income, that was at least 1% or right around 1% of the purchase price, then usually that deal would pencil unless you were using some type of crazy financing or some other extraordinary circumstance. So for example, if the monthly rent on that rental property, say it was going to rent for $1,000 a month, if you were buying it for $100,000, well, that $1,000 monthly rent is 1% of that $100,000. That was probably going to pencil and probably going to be a good deal. And obviously, if you bought it for less, if it was renting for that same $1,000 and you bought it for, say, $85,000 or $90,000, well, even better. But if you were paying more than $100,000, say you were paying $120,000 or $150,000 or something like that, well, maybe all of a sudden now it doesn't look so good, right? And again, there's a lot of considerations. You have to consider the local market. You have to consider property taxes. You have to consider property insurance, how you're doing your financing, those sorts of things. But to kind of do a deeper dive, but it would give you an idea of whether or not it warranted additional consideration for investment. And so back in the day, they were all around, 1% or so, sometimes a little bit more than that. I don't know how much I've talked about this on the show, but my first turnkey rental property that I purchased, I bought for $84,000, and the monthly rent at the time was $885. So if you took the monthly rent of $885 and you divided that into the purchase price of $84,000, obviously that's going to be just north of 1%. Here, let's bust out a quick calculator. We do our $885 over $84,000. That's 1.05% rent to price ratio. So that's what we were looking at the time, and it produced positive cash flow, still does to this day. Obviously, rents generally go up, and in this case, on that particular property, they did. So that's always a good thing. Well, fast forward several properties later, I know when my wife bought her first one, she was going to get the same $885 a month in rent, but her purchase price, instead of being the $84,000 that I paid a few years earlier, hers was $98,500. And when you do the math on that, you take the $885 monthly rent divided by the purchase price of $98,500, and you come up with a 0.89, almost a 0.9% rent to price ratio. Not quite as good as the 1.05 at first glance, right? And I remember, it was a little under 1%, and she was kind of on the fence about it. And, there's a lot of things to consider. It's a nice looking property. It's mostly brick. It's on a cul-de-sac. Had a fenced in yard. It was 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. So really nice property. She ended up buying it. But I know there was a little bit of a period of time where she was kind of hesitant to do that because it didn't initially meet the 1% rule, right? And again, as I mentioned, depending on when you run your numbers for true cash flow, you have to look at a bunch of other factors. And it just so happened at the time that she bought it, the interest rates were very, very different than they are today. And I think she locked in a 30-year fixed at, I want to say it was it's better than the 3.75 we have on most of them. I believe it was 3.625. If memory serves. And so that was pretty good. And that actually has stayed occupied since she bought it back in, what was it? She purchased that one. I'm trying to look at my notes here. Yeah, May of 2021. So basically 3 years ago. And since that time, there have been modest rent increases. In fact, that the resident that was in that property who's getting ready to move out any day now, has been in there the whole time. So her rent started at $885 and gradually it went up over time, and it was at $1085 most recently. So it only went up a couple $100 a month, and you're probably thinking, yeah, okay, great. Well, big deal, right? Well, first of all, there hadn't been any turnover in that property for that period of time, about 3 years, and that's typically going to be a cash flow killer as far as turnover goes when you have to pay to get it rent ready for the next resident. But it was nice to have that, same tenant in there for that period of time. Well, now we've been in touch with the property management company recently, and they're getting ready to turn it over. As I mentioned, the tenant, she's getting ready to move out any day now. And they're going to, as they put it, test the market at $1,350. So now that same rental that was purchased for $98,500 had the same financing on that, still on a 30-year fixed at 3.625%. All of a sudden went from $885 and gradually up to $1085, and hopefully we'll see what happens. But the hope is that we'll be able to place the next resident in at about $1,350, which is kind of a astronomically high and kind of an abnormally high, in my opinion, rental rate increase. But one of the ways that you can keep residents in the properties is that you have to be competitive and you want to make sure you're close to market rents, but at the same time you don't want to sticker shock anybody and just jack the rent on somebody and force them to move out and force a turnover and that sort of thing. So had the resident stayed there, we probably wouldn't be anywhere near $1,350. It probably would have been just north of $1,100, maybe approaching $1,200, for example, over time. But in this case, we are going to have a turn, and so we're going to try to release it at a much higher rate. Point being, what didn't necessarily look like or seem to be a good deal at the time, or maybe that was questionable at the time, is going to turn into basically just a cash flow crusher as far as that goes. I mean, if we can really get $1,350 or anywhere close to that, as your principal and interest component of the mortgage payment stays the same in this case because it's on a fixed rate mortgage for 30 years, yeah, your property insurance and property taxes will generally go up over time. But as long as your rental rate will typically outpace that, you're going to continue to grow your cash flow on that property. So anyway, that was kind of an example of, not so sure if we're going to do this, and I know she's really excited about it, as am I, kind of looking at it now where it's really taken off. And we're in an interesting time. Is that always going to happen in a period of 3 years? No, absolutely not. Are there going to be home runs for every single property that you purchase? No, absolutely not, right? But, the reason that we do this is to experience positive trends like this over time where rents generally go up, the largest portion of the mortgage generally stays the same, and you begin to increase your cash flow over time. So it's not really a get-rich-quick thing. And for the premium subscribers, I'm actually going to do a bonus episode for you guys about an investment opportunity that I came across recently, and I'll just save all the details, but it was pretty interesting. Things aren't always what they seem. And so anyway, with turnkey rentals, I guess where I'm going with this is, even though at first glance, it might not be something that you think is going to light the world on fire tomorrow, if you're patient with it over time, generally speaking, good things tend to happen. So anyway, we were on vacation. We were in Mexico, having a great time, had a few margaritas, dare I say, and was still getting these property emails, and all of a sudden I saw one come across, and this is going back to, you really need to know what you're looking for. And in this particular case, the market that we buy in, we're very familiar with, and we've been there several times, the zip codes, where we want to buy and where we don't buy, where it makes sense, where it doesn't make sense. And we've driven the streets and the neighborhoods. We've kept pretty close tabs on this thing. I would argue that we understand some of the neighborhoods and zip codes in the rental market that we purchase in, which is about 8 hours away from where we personally live, probably better than we do our own market where we live and have our primary residence. So that's also important. Even though you have, teams on the ground that are doing things for you from a distance, it's important to understand the market to the extent that you can. So you got to have your buy box. You got to know what you're looking for, where you want to buy, where you don't want to buy. And it doesn't really matter which market you're considering. This is, I think, would apply across the board. And so normally we like to look at 3 bedrooms and then a minimum of 1.5, ideally 2 bathrooms, kind of your standard type of home. If it's a 4-2 like she got, totally fine. If it's a 3-1.5 like the one I'm about to buy, totally fine. But usually we're not going to deviate too much from that. So anything that's a 2-1 or a 3-1, for example, is pretty much out immediately. There's also a handful of zip codes, again, that we just don't buy in. And so Even though I had a couple margs rocking, we were on vacation, and I saw this come through. This happened to be a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bathroom property. Square footage wise, it was right around 1,100 square feet. So it, not the biggest house by any means, but a decent size, a little on the smaller end, but a decent size for a rental property. And the rent to price ratio on this came out to a 0.87. So way higher, or noticeably higher than the 0.8 that we were seeing, the 0.83 that we were seeing. I think prior to this, maybe 0.85 was about on the top end of what we had seen in recent times. And again, that's just a back of the napkin. Hey, does this warrant further consideration? A lot of people will tell you now the 1% rule, I don't want to call it a thing of the past, but for new purchases, it's harder and harder to come by, especially if you are buying turnkey. Some people will go down to like a 0.7 and say that you can make that cash flow. I don't know that I agree with that. I think 0.8-ish is usually where, the numbers can start to make sense, although they're still a little bit tight. And then as you get closer to, 0.85, 0.9 and up, if you can find them, those are typically going to be more competitive. So this was 0.87, right? The bed bath count matched up. It was a mostly brick property. That's another thing we typically look for. So that was good. It had a carport. That was great. It was in the right zip code. The rent amount, that's another thing. When we're looking at these, we typically don't buy and rent below a certain threshold. And that number has changed over time, but there are still properties that rent for significantly less per month, and you have to be very well aware of the types of residents and tenants you're going to get in a particular rental range, right, in a price range. So, for example, even if it's a single family, it could be a duplex, could be a quad, whatever. If the rents are below a certain threshold, you're typically going to get people that might be more transient. You're probably going to have more delinquencies. You might have a lot of non-payments. And so, the stability factor on the part of the resident or the tenant is typically not going to be as strong when you get into those lower price points. So we try to play in a certain area. Anyway, this particular property was going to rent for $1,295. We got a signed lease at $1,295. Purchase price on this one is $148,300. And so again, we're at a 0.87 or so percent rent to price ratio. So anyway, decided to go for it. We happened to be at dinner and went ahead and let the turnkey company know, yep, I want it. They sent over the contract. We got it locked up. And like I said, we're at this point pretty close to closing up. The inspection report, here's another thing for anybody that is considering turnkey. And I've said this before, and I'll say this again and again, and everybody that will listen to it, and that is the inspection report. I don't care what anybody says. We don't normally give advice on this show, so take it for what you will. But I would strongly encourage everybody, whether it's a primary residence for yourself or, in this case, we're talking about investment property, to get an inspection. I don't think there will ever be a situation where I would be willing to waive an inspection. And I will tell you that the money that you spend on an inspection report is almost always going to be money well spent. Even in this case, I will say this has been the cleanest inspection report that I've received back, and I've used the same inspector for all of our rental properties that we have, the turnkeys, and it's the cleanest one with the fewest issues, but even still, the amount that it would cost to otherwise remedy a few of the things would significantly outweigh the cost of the inspection report. Plus, it just gives you peace of mind, knowing that, hey, you had somebody else that's not the turnkey provider, that's not the operator, that went out, that you hired, they work for you, you paid them a nice fee, and they're going to find whatever it is to find, and then you can go back to the turnkey provider and say, hey, can you fix this stuff? And that's exactly what I did. In fact, the software that my inspector uses, and I'm sure there's other ones out there too, it's really nice because you can look at the inspection report, and there's actually a function on their website once you're logged in that you can create a repair list or a request list from the seller, in this case, the turnkey operator. And so I basically went through and asked them to fix every little thing, and there weren't that many of them, but you're always going to have stuff on inspection reports. And I asked them to fix a whole bunch of things, everything from trimming some trees that were hanging over the roof to insulating one of the coolant lines to, you name it, blowing in some more insulation in the attic, for example, just some little things. And you're able to email that to them and, ask them, hey, I'd like you to do this, this, and this. It has the pictures from the inspection report, super clean, really nice. They just got back to me with pictures of everything that's been completed, and, it's really, really nice. Now, you might be wondering, well, why was this property rent to price ratio, why was that more favorable than some of the other ones? And there's no real reason for it other than in this particular case, they purchased it back from another investor. And my first thought was, why in the world would an investor sell this property back to them? And I remember actually the first house I ever bought, we had a turn at one time and they said, hey, here's the turnover bill. Here's how much it's going to be, yada, yada, yada. Oh, by the way, we could really use the inventory. We totally understand if you want to hold on to this property for the long term. But in the event that you don't want to pay this turnover bill and you're looking to get out, we can make you a cash offer to buy the home back for this price if you want to. Naturally, I didn't do that, and they totally understood that. But my guess is whatever this particular investor was going through, they decided to say, yeah, I'll take that deal. So they originally sold it to this investor a couple years prior for actually slightly more than I'm paying for it. They bought it back from him a couple years later for, a little bit of a discount. They went in and upgraded some things and put some work into it. And then obviously they marked it up to make their profit and they're selling it to me. I bought sort of another investor buyback. I think it was actually house number 2 that I had ever purchased. And that property has since doubled in value. I think I bought that back in the day for just under $75,000. I think at the time it was renting for either maybe $825 or $850, something like that. It's since doubled in value. Rents have, continued to go up. So anyway, I'm in this for the long term. Hopefully, if you're considering buying turnkey rentals, you're going to be in it for the long term. And I don't really have plans, not to say that I never will, but I really don't have any plans to sell any of these properties. They generally will do better and better over time. And so this was an investor buyback. They bought it back from this investor, like I said, and they, did a little bit of work to it, and they're turning around and selling it to me. Everything is pretty much brand new from 2 years ago when they completely revamped it. But because technically it's a couple years old and the roof is 2 years old, it's still basically a new roof, but it's not a brand new roof. They discounted it a little bit, so I'm getting a slightly better price than the other investor purchased it for. But I'm really, really excited about this one, and hoping that I can continue to slowly grow our single-family rental turnkey portfolio. But the rent-to-price ratio is around, like I said, a 0.87. So is that always going to happen? No. Did I get lucky? I don't know, maybe. Is it a home run? No, it's not. Am I getting a decent financing? I would say so, right? I'm locking in a 30-year fixed, in this case, at 6.5%. I did have to pay a couple of points to buy that down a little bit. Normally, instead of putting the 20% down that I would typically do and have done on pretty much all the other properties, I'm putting a little bit more down on this one, right around 25%. So there's a couple things there where, you can do some things like putting a little bit more down and buying points to get a better rate. And if we looked right now, if I go back over to this other tab here, at the time of this recording, the average 30-year fixed, let me go back here. If you have like just stellar credit, 800 and up, it's showing at 7.14. And if you had, let's say, a 740 and above, it's right around 7.4. And if you had somebody that was in, like, say, around 700, it'd be closer to 7.6. So generally speaking, your investment property loans are going to be usually about 100 basis points or 1% higher than those for owner occupants, but that's not always the case. And that's something else. I was actually talking to a buddy of mine. I had lunch with him this week, and he said, wow, 6.5, that's pretty good. I would assume for sure you'd be at least in the sevens, if not higher than that. And if I didn't, pay a couple points to buy it down a little bit, and I put down 20 instead of 25, I easily could have been in the sevens. So, that's a personal decision. You got to run the numbers and figure out what works for you. But even though I don't love it, and by far it's going to be the highest interest rate mortgage that we have, 6.5% locked in over a 30-year time period, if you look at historical averages, is still probably at, if not below them. So I'm okay with that. And like I mentioned on the property that we were on the fence about, that my wife purchased, a few years back for that 98.5, things generally work themselves out and, can do better than you might think they're going to do initially. So it's not to say things can't go wrong. They do. They can. But generally speaking, people say don't wait to buy real estate and wait. And so that's kind of the plan for this one. But it does meet the goal of, cash flow. And it's actually, in my opinion, a better deal than I bought on the last one that I purchased. The last purchase I made was at a 0.81% rent to price ratio, it's doing okay. I bought that one almost 2 years ago. Didn't buy anything in 2023. I'm going to go ahead and get this one here in 2024 and hopefully just continue to slowly build over time as far as that goes. But I just thought it was interesting, and you might be listening to this right after my last episode when I said, oh man, I'm not doing this, I'm not buying it, I can't get the numbers to pencil, which at the time was true, but in this particular case, everything seemed to make sense for this deal. Would I have loved it to get it at a lower price? Yeah, of course, but given everything from the property bedroom bathroom count, the zip code, all that stuff that I mentioned, I mean, I just think that this is going to be a good one. So I'm really, really excited about it. Now, will it be another 2 years until we buy another one? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. We're supposed to be back up at the top of the list here in a few months, so the list seems to have shortened up a little bit. We'll see what happens with interest rates. I'm not really expecting anything crazy to happen anytime soon, but who knows? And, I've heard this on other shows too. People always say, well, you know what? Marry the property, date the rate, right? Marry the property, date the rate. So you can lock it up and, as long as it makes sense at that number, great. But longer term, if rates were to come back down, you can always refinance, right? And the same time, you've locked in not only the ability to own that property, but you've also locked in your purchase price, right? But you can refi the rate later if and when you need to. Now, will I do that on a property like this where the loan is just north of $100,000? I don't know. Probably not. We'd probably have to be right around 5 or so, or somewhere in the low 5s for me to even consider doing that. But it's possible, right? Who knows? We'll see what happens. One of the things that I may have talked about on another show was not really a portfolio loan, but what's called a DSCR loan, a debt service coverage ratio loan, where I basically cross-collateralized a handful of properties, killed off the individual mortgages, put them on a commercial mortgage under the LLC, and was able to pull all my cash out in the form of a cash out refi, which is tax-free because debt's not taxable, lower the interest rate from just north of a 5% weighted average rate, I think it was literally 5.01%, down to 3.75, and still lock it up over a 30-year time frame, which in hindsight, I look back and think, wow, I look like a genius, but in reality, I wasn't. I just got lucky. And at the time, those DSCR loans weren't as prevalent and popular as they've become over the past couple of years, or at least the people that I talked to weren't really all that familiar with them. And so I was kind of flying blind a little bit and just had to take a leap of faith. And looking back, I'm glad I did. But again, as I've said before, I kind of got lucky as far as that goes. I don't think I'm a genius by any stretch of the imagination. So anyway, I wanted to record this just to give a little update on, Turnkey in 2024. There's different markets out there. There's a lot of different lender incentives that you'll find. I don't have any real incentives on this particular purchase, but I know in some of the other typically higher priced markets, you'll see different providers that are advertising like rate buy downs essentially. So they'll say, hey, we're going to buy your rate down. I've seen them as low as like 4.75% on a 30-year, well, actually not on a 30-year fix, on a 30-year amortization, but normally it's fixed for a certain period of time. It could be a handful of years, 5, 7, 10 years, and, presumably you would do something with the property during that time, whether you refinanced it into long-term permanent fixed rate or you ended up somehow wanting to get rid of it, whatever the case is. But a lot of them will essentially buy and lock up pools of money at lower interest rates to entice buyers to want to purchase with them. And obviously, if you can get a property at, say, 4.75 or even call it 5% in today's environment versus, 6, 7, 8, whatever it might be, that's very attractive to, the investor as the turnkey buyer. The other thing that a lot of them will do, sometimes in conjunction with that, is I've heard of several companies out there where they will do sort of a 1 year, or I've seen it up to 2 years of free, quote unquote, free property management. So if you're normally paying 8%, 9%, 10%, whatever the percentage is of gross collected rents, typically, they're going to waive that. So, if it's, let's say it was renting for $1,000 a month, just quick, easy numbers, and you're paying a 10% property management fee, every time they collect that gross rental income of $1,000 a month, they're taking 10% or $100 off the top. And then, you get your $900 minus, whatever other expenses you might have that goes to you in the form of an owner draw or owner distribution. Well, if they're offering 1 or 2 years of free property management, then in this example, that 10% management fee is not coming out, or at least for that time period. So people are getting creative. A lot of times these are new construction homes where the builders pretty much don't want to sit on them and float the carrying costs. They'd rather spend a couple extra dollars, lock up the money, buy pools of money at lower interest rates, maybe offer some free property management in exchange to be able to move the property, make a nice little profit on it. And depending on the market that you're looking for and the type of properties that you're purchasing, whether that's, new construction or not, it could make sense for you. I've not come across anything where, even with those incentives, because I've looked at some of them in different markets, personally, I've not found anything that really works for me. Or if I have found anything that otherwise would work or pencil in terms of the numbers, it's not a house that I would probably want to own as a long-term rental. No disrespect to those out there that might live in or be renting a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. That's fine, but more than likely, in my opinion, that's going to be one person. Maybe that's a single parent with a kid. You're generally not going to get a family with any sort of permanence that's going to move into a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom home. The numbers might pencil great, depending on the assumptions that you're using. But if they're not going to stay and you're going to have consistent turns, then typically you're not going to make as much money over a longer period of time. So I don't think that's necessarily news to anybody, but it's something worth considering, because a lot of times some of these emails, I'm on different lists and I get these emails that are like, X percentage cash on cash return, or, this percentage ROI. You really got to be careful out there, because the other thing you want to look at for anyone considering turnkey are the assumptions. So even the turnkey provider that we use, that they'll have their own assumptions for here's how much we estimate the cash flow to be, but you still have to run your own numbers. And so I don't think enough people talk about this. There's some providers out there that do this, but you should be looking at a certain percentage for example, vacancy. So I'll give you an example. One of the calculations that we typically do is I will use an 8% factor, and I call it vacancy. Now, that's roughly 1 month a year. Are you going to have 1 month a year where your property is empty every single year? Well, surely I hope not, right? But I use that for a few different things. So first of all, you're going to have every now and then somebody that might be there for 1 or 2 years, okay? You're also going to have time periods where they might be there for 3 years or 4 years or hopefully longer, right? So you're not going to have that 1 month of vacancy every single year. However, depending on the provider that you're using or the property management company that you're using, there could be other costs that are associated. So when I put in for an 8% vacancy in terms of reserves, when I'm trying to estimate my numbers and what's the true cash flow going to be, I'm looking at everything from, the actual physical and economic vacancy. So if their ass is physically not in the property and they're not paying rent, I'm going to factor that in. But also, it's going to kind of go in reserve and cover things like, well, what if there is a lease renewal fee? What if they do stay another year? Does your property management company charge you anything for that? And I've worked with a couple in the past. One of them did, or does, I should say, the one I'm with now. They charge $200 every time they renew a lease, and the other one didn't. And at first glance, you think, well, why the hell would I want to pay that? And some people, they balk at that fee, and I don't love it. But $200, I would much rather pay $200 knowing that my property management company and turnkey operator did a great job for that resident, and they're willing to stay hopefully at an increased rate, or at least every couple of years, possibly an increased rental rate, than move out and cause a turnover, which is typically going to cost you way more than $200, probably in the thousands depending on the property condition, right? So that's one thing. The company that didn't charge that, well, quite frankly, and they're not going to come out and tell you this, but they're not necessarily incentivized to keep people there long term, because they're not, other than their gross collected, percentage of gross collected rents, 8%, 9%, 10%, whatever they're charging you, they're typically not making money in any other way unless they're marking up maintenance and repairs, and that's a whole separate issue. We can get into that here in a minute. But they're not getting everything. They're not incentivized to keep them there. I'd rather have the company that says, you know what, we're going to hit you with $200 every year that they stay. And in my mind, I don't love it, but $200, that gives them at least some incentive to continue to treat them the way they need to be treated and make sure the property is, kept up with in great condition as far as, running it on a month-to-month basis. So anyway, my 8% vacancy allowance, that's everything from physical/economic vacancy when somebody moves out and they're not paying. It's also to cover little things like the $200 lease renewal, right? that comes up in my case, and yours could be nothing. It could be 200, 300, 500. I don't know, right? Check with your property management company or turnkey provider, but that's something that you want to at least be aware of. And then also for the actual turn itself. So again, if you have somebody that's there for 3 or 4 years and you've saved 8% of gross collected rents for that 3 or 4 year time period, and then you have a turnover and that's an expense to you, well, you want to have some money typically set aside in reserves, especially if you have a smaller portfolio. As your portfolio grows over time, you don't necessarily, not to say you don't have to do this, but generally speaking, the properties will kind of, I don't want to use the, for lack of a better phrase, cover each other while things are going on. So for example, I can choose if I want to, if we have a turn and it costs $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, for example, they can take that out of the rents on the other properties, and really you don't even get a bill, right? You might have, okay, I got, you got to go to your reserves, or hopefully you're keeping at least a few months. That's typically what I do. I keep about 3 months of principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, so the mortgage payment, in the business checking accounts, and then I have a separate account for reserves, and that's a whole nother thing. But anyway, what I'm saying is you can basically cash flow those turns once you have a large enough portfolio as you continue to grow. But if you're just getting started and maybe you have one property, maybe you have 2 or 3 properties, and all of a sudden now things might be a little bit tighter and you can't quite do that, it's good to be putting money aside and have money in reserves. So the other part of that 8%, even if you're not quote unquote using it every single year, but when you do have the turns, you're going to have some money put aside for that. So that's something that I consider, going back to assumptions and running your own assumptions and not just strictly relying on what the turnkey operator or the seller is telling you. Because quite frankly, from what I've seen, I think the highest I've ever seen on a pro forma, which is basically them just saying, hey, here's how we expect the property to perform, might be like 5%. And most of the time it's 2%, it's 3%. And quite frankly, sometimes it's 0. They don't account for it at all. They want the numbers to look as great as possible so that, you just fall in love with the numbers and you decide to go for it. So you got to run your own numbers. So I'll typically use 8%, and I'll call that for vacancy. Then you're going to have things like capital expenditures. You're going to have a water heater go out. You're going to have a roof that needs to be put on at some point. Now, the way that we are buying these, and hopefully that you are buying these if you're considering buying turnkey rental properties, is that they are newly and freshly rehabbed for the most part, right? So, again, as I mentioned, the one I'm buying now, the roof's a couple years old, but it's not 15 years old, right? So most of the time the roof is brand new and the major components are brand new, and that's great. So you're not going to have any CapEx expenses more than likely right away. Now, if you're buying something that's distressed or it's not from a turnkey provider and you're still in the rental game, okay, fine. Hopefully, again, you're getting your inspections and they can kind of see, okay, the roof looks to be about this old, and it looks like, you can kind of do a educated ballpark calculation on remaining useful life and things like that and figure out what you're going to need to have put aside. But it's still, I think, a good practice to put something away for capital expenditures. So some people, everyone's different, but some people on an older property that's not turnkey, that's not freshly rehabbed, they might tell you closer to like a 10% of gross rents number. I typically use 5% because, again, I'm buying turnkey, and most of the time these bigger issues are hopefully not going to happen for quite some time, but you still want to account for that. The other thing that's going to typically come up is just your general repairs and maintenance, right? I was at the gym earlier today, happened to log into the portal, just getting warmed up on the treadmill, and logged in and saw that there was a bill for one of the properties. They took care of it. I think it was like 200 and it was like 203 and change. We'll call it $200, right? No big deal, right? You're going to expect that things like that are going to happen. And sometimes it's going to happen for multiple properties in the same month. And other times you're going to have multiple months go by where everything is great. And knock on wood, for the most part, other than the repair I just mentioned and the turn that's about to happen, that's kind of the way the portfolio has been running, at least to the past 6 months or so. Things have been great this year. We kind of got killed a little bit in 2023. So, it's going to move in cycles, and you just want to make sure, again, that you have reserves that are set aside and put aside to handle those things, especially as you're growing your portfolio. One general rule of thumb that I've heard from somebody that I know in the real estate space, he typically tells people that you need to have roughly 3 to 5% of your total portfolio value in some type of cash or cash equivalent as reserves. So for example, if the value of your rental portfolio was $1 million, you would want to have somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 liquid and available to handle any sort of repair, emergency, insurance deductible, things like that. Everyone's going to be different. There's some guys out there and gals out there that'll tell you, hey, once you hit 10 or 15, like you can keep minimal reserves because again, you can cash flow your repairs, you can cash flow your turns. And generally speaking, you might be able to do that unless and until everything hits at once. So I'm kind of a big believer in doing both and making sure that you are a little bit cash heavy to some extent to make sure that you can weather any storm. But at the same time, you don't want to go overly crazy with it and, keep too much in reserves or in cash because, again, as your portfolio grows, you're typically going to be able to float some of those things, over time. So those are just some things to be thinking about. I wanted to just do this episode to talk a little bit about Turnkey, how our experience has been relatively recently, the one that we're in the process of buying here and closing on pretty much any day now. And then just to tell you a few things that you might want to be thinking about and look for, especially when you're evaluating for yourself whether or not it's something that you want to move forward with. Again, don't just take at face value whatever they're telling you. You want to make sure you're running your own numbers as far as reserves go and things along those lines. So that about wraps it up. I might do another short, quick update or something like that after closing if there's anything crazy that happens. But at this point, it all seems, I don't want to say not too good to be true because that's a bad phrase that normally bites you in the ass, right? But it's one of those things where everything is going smoothly, knock on wood. I think the purchase price is fair. I think the property is great. The residents already moved in. There's a signed lease in place. The repairs have been done. The pictures have been sent. Everything's moving through underwriting as far as the loan goes. Fine. The numbers are okay on that as far as interest rates. The cash flow is going to be decent. It's not going to be great. It's not going to be like my wife's that hopefully we get the 1350. We'll see what happens, but you just got to give things time to work themselves out. So I wanted to do this again, just a quick update, some things to think about, some things to look out for. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys if you're considering buying a turnkey rental or investing in turnkey rental real estate. A lot of people are saying turnkey's dead. I don't think it's dead. I don't think it's as easy and as profitable in the short term as it once was. I do think looking longer term potentially could be one of the more profitable investments that are made, as I mentioned in my last show. So I'm really excited about it. And if it's something you're interested in, hopefully you're also excited about it. If you guys have any questions, use the fan mail feature, text the show. You can go in your show notes. There should be a little hyperlink towards the top that says send us a text message. Feel free to use that. If you want to email the show, it's realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. We will write you back if you write into us. Once again, congratulations to Thomas N. on winning the $25 e-gift card giveaway for our premium subscribers. Also, thank you to our premium subscriber that wrote in with a picture of the Navy Real Talk Personal Finance shirt with the white logo. Looks really fresh. I think I actually might order one for myself. I don't know if you guys know this. I think I've said this before, but I'm also a subscriber to my own show. I'm also a premium subscriber, so that's always kind of fun. All right, guys. Well, this is it. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and we will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.